Hey guys, we're going to be learning about the mechanisms of the respiratory system. So, in other words, how do you breathe? How do we get those tissues to get the oxygen it needs for cellular respiration and to be able to function properly? So, we're going to start off with ventilation. Ventilation means to breathe. So, this is breathing in and breathing out. So, the definition of it's literally breathing consists of two phases: inspiration, that means to inhale, and expiration means to exhale. A lot of you probably know inhale and exhale, but in the scientific community, it's inspiration and expiration. So, it's all, we kind of are going to be putting in a little bit of chemistry into this now. Boyle's law: volume changes lead to pressure changes. So, in other words, like if you had a box, the bigger the box, the more room the gases have to move, right? So therefore the pressure would decrease. So as volume increases, your pressure decreases. So volume changes leads to pressure changes, and the pressure change leads to flow of gases to equalize the pressure. Gases are always moving from high to low. So they want everything to be at zero, right? We want everything to be at atmospheric pressure of zero. And that's like kind of like the law of the land, I guess. Like everything's always moving from high to low to make everything equal out. So this is what Boyle's law is. So P1 V1 equals P2 V2. I'll talk to you about this more tomorrow. Tomorrow will be all about practicing this. But at constant temperature, the pressure of a gas varies inversely with its volume. So I'll show you like a picture, but essentially, if, like I said with the box, so like the smaller the box, the less room that gas has to move, so your pressure is higher, right? Just think about that. Like if the walls were like closing in on all the kids in the class, like we would have less space to move and the pressure would increase, right? If the walls were going further away, we would have a lot more room, the volume increases, so therefore the pressure would decrease. All right, so inspiration. These are all the steps. So you're going to breathe in. Okay, so first step is your intercostal muscles will contract. Your intercostal muscles are the muscles in between your rib cage. Okay, so in between each rib. So those contract, and then your diaphragm also contracts, and then your diaphragm will move inferiorly. So your diaphragm will move down, and at the same time, your rib cage moves up. So just imagine now what happens, like if you want to like take your hands and kind of figure that out. So like diaphragm goes down, rib cage goes up, therefore volume has now increased. Right? So in other words, you gave that space, more space for the gas to move. The volume has now increased, right? So diaphragm down, rib cage up. So all that space has now increased the volume. Lungs are stretched and the intrapulmonary volume increases. It's pretty much a repeat. So now the pressure drops, right? Because the pressure is decreased due to the fact, so -1. So it's one less than what the atmosphere is. So basically it's lower than the outside world. The gases just have more space to move, so there's less pressure. The air gases flow into the lung down its pressure gradient until it's at zero. So a lot of kids think, or a lot of people think, that when you breathe, you actually are sucking the air in. That's causing the volume to increase. But in actuality, you are contracting muscles, making volume increase, and that is just causing Boyle's law, just the law of nature for gases to flow in. So here's like a kind of a picture, right? So this is where we would start kind of, but just imagine the volume increasing. So diaphragm moves down, chest kind of moves upward, and then therefore high to low, and gas flows in. Deep or forced inhalation during vigorous exercise or a pulmonary disease, volume further increased by activity of accessory muscles. So when you are breathing really heavily, like going for a run, or if you had a disease, like there's other muscles as well in the neck, the pectoralis minor, that would cause the ribs to raise even more. Okay, so expiration. So now the volume is large. Now how do you decrease the volume? And it's all relaxation now, right? So you really are only contracting when you inspire. Expiration now. Okay, so intercostal muscles, so the muscles in between your rib cage, will relax. Diaphragm rises because that also relaxes, and the rib cage descends. So just imagine that big space squeezes together. It's a passive process because everything's relaxing. The thoracic cavity volume decreases, and therefore so does your lungs. So your lungs actually recoil, meaning it just goes back to its original size. Intrapulmonary volume decreases. So now we're inside the lungs as well. So now that pressure in there is +1. It's 1 higher than the atmosphere around us. We want to be at 0. So to make it 0, because just imagine the space around all those gases go towards it, and it's just like, I don't have anywhere to go, right? It's just like they're all being squished together. So therefore, they flow out of the lung down the pressure gradient until the pressure is at 0. So first you decrease the volume, causing the pressure to increase higher than the atmosphere, causing it to flow out of your body. Expiration. So yeah, so just make sure you know like the different steps. I'm splitting up the days, so tomorrow I'll go over more of that. Okay, so now next is gas exchange. So now that we talked about the whole process of breathing, now we're going to talk about how gases are exchanged. There's 2 places between in the lungs and at the tissue, of course, right? That's where the gas is. That's where oxygen and CO2 switch between tissues. Okay, that's what gas exchange means. Respiratory membrane has gas on one side and blood flowing on the other, and that's called the air-blood barrier. Exchanges are made according to the law of diffusion, movement towards lower concentration. Again, kind of the same thing. So if you guys remember from biology, or if you're in any AP classes, you guys probably know diffusion very well. But basically for us, we just need to know across that membrane, it's always going to move from high to low. You want everything to be the same, right? On both sides, we want everything to have the same amount. So, so always just, if you understand like what has a higher concentration, that will help you remember which way things move. So you have external respiration. We call it external because the gases are coming from outside of the body. I guess technically they all come from outside the body, but directly from the outside. So this is going to be between the alveoli. If you remember, those are those grape little sacs, and the pulmonary capillary. So in other words, the lungs, right? So the alveoli to the pulmonary capillary, that will go back to the heart to be pumped to the body. Okay, so that's the first. I hope you can think like alveoli would have higher concentration of oxygen, so therefore the oxygen is going to flow into the pulmonary capillary. Why does this have more oxygen? Because you just breathed it in, right? Like you're constantly breathing in oxygen. So that would have a higher concentration of oxygen. This would have a higher concentration of CO2 because it just came from the body, and they're just going to flip sides. So you can breathe out the CO2 and the oxygen can go to the tissues. Okay, so external respiration. Internal respiration. Now we're like all the way to the body tissues. So we're at the liver, we're at the muscles, we're in the tissues. So the body tissue capillaries and the blood vessels that just came from the heart, right? The oxygenated blood that just came from the heart. So the blood tissues are going to have a higher concentration of CO2 because it just went through cellular respiration. So it's using up the oxygen, giving up CO2. The blood vessel just is bringing this oxygenated blood, so it will have a higher concentration of oxygen and it will switch. Okay, so let's start with external respiration. So we're right here. We're in the lung, more specifically at the alveoli. So just imagine you just breathe in. What happens next, right? So it's all going to be this gas exchange. Okay, so oxygen is diffused from the alveoli to the pulmonary capillaries. Why? Because you have more oxygen in the alveoli than in the blood because the body cells continually remove oxygen. So just remember that your alveoli has more oxygen. At the same time, carbon dioxide is diffused from the pulmonary capillaries to the alveoli, and then you'll kind of breathe it out. Why? Because the concentration of CO2 is much higher in the pulmonary capillaries than it is in the alveoli because body cells are releasing CO2. Here's like a picture. So this is the alveoli, high concentration of oxygen in here. This would be like the capillary, giving the CO2 back. And then now this oxygenated blood will go back to the heart, be pumped out of the aorta, and then be delivered to the body. Okay, so now we're internal respiration. So we're going to jump we're skipping the heart. We're jumping all the way to a tissue. So let's pretend that this is the liver tissue, okay? The liver tissue is going through cellular respiration, right? So it's taking oxygen, making your ATP, and then also releasing CO2. So just imagine that you have all this CO2 in here because it just went through cellular respiration, and then your blood is delivering oxygen because it just came from your aorta, right? So oxygen's going to go from here to here, right? Because it's high to low. So here, I have a whole bunch. Here, you have some. And I know you need it because you're going through cellular respiration. And then the tissues, like here, I have tons of CO2. Please take it back, right? So now it's the capillaries and go to the venule to the vein and all the way back to the heart to be pumped to the lungs to be oxygenated again. Okay, so this is internal respiration between the tissues and your capillary. Okay, so oxygen diffuses from the blood into the tissue. Oxygen in the tissue is always in the Y. I didn't put Y here, but the reason why is because oxygen in the tissue is always lower than in the systemic arterial blood. In order to reach equilibrium, oxygen moves rapidly from blood into tissues. Okay, it just went through cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide diffuses from tissue into the blood. Why? Because CO2 is higher in the tissues. It just went through cellular respiration, using up oxygen and giving off CO2. Okay? So, as a summary, the gas exchanges that occur between the blood and the alveoli and between the blood and the tissue cells take place by simple diffusion, driven by the partial pressure gradient of oxygen and CO2 that exist on the opposite sides of the exchange membrane. So, in other words, it just depends on which one has the higher concentration, right? Is it the alveoli that is you're breathing in and constantly getting oxygen from the atmosphere? Or is it at the tissues, which have a high concentration of CO2 because it just went through cellular respiration? Just take a step back and think, why? Like, why would something have a higher concentration? And it should make more sense. And again, I have a little activity that will help you guys to more of a hands-on activity that would help you understand this tomorrow. So here's a picture here. So just showing you. So this is like the external respiration. They call it external because it's like the oxygen is directly coming from external environment, and then your internal will be in your tissues. Okay, and just remember where your concentration gradient is. If you want to pause this and look a little bit more at this graph, I know some students are more like visual learners and they love diagrams. That's why I added this. I love it. But you can kind of see the heart, right? So the alveoli oxygenates the blood. The oxygen's coming in, CO2 is coming out, right? That's that breathing. So oxygen's coming in the alveoli, being carried to the pulmonary veins towards the heart. Aorta would deliver it to the tissues, and then it would deliver it to the tissues here. Cellular respiration, so carbon dioxide is being released. It would go back into the capillaries and be delivered back through veins, the vena cavas, to the heart. And then it would go back to the alveoli, where the CO2 would be expired or released. The body would breathe it out, and then the whole process would happen again. Okay, so the last thing, and sorry it's like so much, but when I review this stuff, guys, I'm going to split it up into days, so don't worry. Okay, so gas transport. So again, if you feel like this is like overwhelmingly a lot of information, it's okay. I will be like during the week, I'm splitting it up with little activities. So, but now for now, at least you'll get all, because some kids can take it all at the same time, but okay. Okay, oxygen transport. So transport, that means how is it moving from the alveoli to the tissues? Like when it's traveling through the heart and everything, in what form? So oxygen is poorly soluble in water, so it's not like it could just go in the plasma like some other things can, like hormones or something. So it must be carried by hemoglobin of the red blood cell. Oxygen molecules binds to iron in the hemoglobin, Hb, that's what Hb is here, to create oxyhemoglobin. Makes sense, right? Oxygen, hemoglobin. So oxygen plus Hb gives you oxyhemoglobin. So oxyhemoglobin will travel the circulatory system. So just imagine it. So it's like a little like taxi, picks it up, right? Takes it up in the alveoli, travels through the heart, and will go all the way to the tissues where it will be passed on to the tissues to go through cellular respiration. Oxygen molecule will release from hemoglobin before diffusion into systemic tissue. Okay? So most of it, guys, will be transferred this way. So this is what it looks like. So this is your alveoli, the alveolar space. So this is that blood gas space here. So oxygen literally just goes from high to low, right? That high to low, it goes from high to low in here in the tissues, and it will attach to the hemoglobin, and then it becomes oxyhemoglobin. And actually it tells you here 1, 2, 3, 4. There's way more processes to it, but we're just going kind of the easy route. Okay, so now we're going to talk about our carbon dioxide transport. So carbon dioxide, the source, it comes from the tissues. Once the cell uses up the oxygen that came from our atmosphere, it's going to take that oxygen and turn it into carbon dioxide. So how is it transported? So most of carbon dioxide is transported in the plasma as a bicarbonate ion. So remember, most of your plasma is water. So carbon dioxide plus H2O, water, gives you bicarbonate ion. And then once it gets there, it will break down again, or it will break down a little bit more in the plasma, but you don't have to worry about that. So actually, most of it's in the plasma. Before carbon dioxide can diffuse out of the blood into the alveoli, it must first release from its bicarbonate form. So it will go back to being carbon dioxide and water again. So the CO2 will kind of just release and cross the membrane to be released out. A smaller, about 20% of the carbon dioxide is carried inside the red blood cells bound to hemoglobin. So just like oxyhemoglobin, but this one's called carbonohemoglobin. It will do the same thing. So the hemoglobin will pick up the CO2. And again, remember that this is happening at the tissues, right? Because the CO2 is crossing into the blood and to make your HbCO2. Carbon dioxide will release from the hemoglobin before diffusing into the alveoli, where you would breathe it back out into the atmosphere. There's also about 7 to 10% of the CO2 that dissolves in the plasma, and it won't go through any sort of gas exchange at all. So most of it, guys, will, so just as a backup, most of it will become bicarbonate ion. It will be transported in the plasma, just right in the water, the plasma. That's most of it. And then you have 20% that will become the carbinohemoglobin, and 20%, and then the last 7 to 10% will just dissolve. So this is what it kind of looks like. You know, this looks crazy, but so this is at the tissues. This is at the tissues here. So remember, at the tissues, this will be the internal exchange. So here's your hemoglobin here. Your hemoglobin just came in with the oxyhemoglobin, and then it breaks up, and then it crosses, because it's high to low, it will cross and diffuse into the tissues, right? And then your tissue will use all that CO2. Most of it will just go right into the plasma, and then, but a little bit of it will attach to the hemoglobin to become that carbonohemoglobin. Okay, so that's all about breathe. So now we're just going to just look at a couple little things, like tie up some loose ends. So just as a reminder, the control of breathing that happens in the medulla oblongata, it's important and very important. There's a cluster of neurons, and it's a way more in depth, but just for now, just medulla oblongata. As we know, like, you're breathing, like, sometimes you're breathing in a rhythm and you don't even know it's happening. And what's really cool is that, or what's interesting is that we don't even fully understand the origin of that rhythm. We don't know why that's occurring. Some scientists think there's some sort of tissues that's very similar to the heart that is also in the lungs. Some think it's the lung or the heart that's like dictating it, but really it's not fully known why there's this rhythm that's occurring. Okay, so one structure I need to go into with you guys is called the surfactant. It's a detergent-like complex of lipids and proteins produced by the alveolar cells. Basically, it's this like film that is on the inside of your alveoli, and it just makes it where the alveoli, makes it tough, I guess, and makes it where it will keep its structure no matter what, so it won't collapse. And the reason why it's called detergent-like is because, just like in detergent, when you're washing your clothes, the detergent would normally just stick to water, because water is, the polarity in the water usually like grabs onto everything. But this detergent-like complex basically makes it where, because there's a lot of water in your in your alveoli because there's a lot of water in our atmosphere, and it just also makes sure that the water is not sticking to each other. And if it did that, it'd be less space, and then your alveoli would collapse essentially. So basically, like I said, it's just like this film that makes sure that water isn't sticking to each other and causing things to collapse. It keeps its structure. So this is what it would look like, right? So this is this is actually an issue in infants where they have they don't have as much of that structure in the alveoli. So this is your normal alveoli, and this would be like, and there's a film. Just imagine this film in there that's holding it, that's keeping it structure. If that didn't happen, all the water would like basically like start to like attract to one another, and then it would collapse. So that's what happened. That's what it would look like. Okay, so COPD, oh, chronic, not chromic. So if that's in your text, please fix that. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, major cause of death in America. 80% of patients have a history of smoking. 20% is hereditary or bacterial. Irreversible decrease in the ability to force air out of the lungs. I use irreversible quite lightly. I mean, this is from the text from hospitals, but I think you can always reverse damage with food, but that's just me. Okay, so the first type of disease that you get is chronic bronchitis. Many of us have had bronchitis, and we didn't get it from smoking. We got it from a bacterial infection, but it's anytime, but chronic, so it's very bad. So inhaled irritants leads to mucus production and inflammation of the lower respiratory passageways. These obstruct airways and severely impair lung ventilation and gas exchange. So you have a lot of mucus in the lungs, just naturally. And I'll show you a picture of that, I think, in a little bit. So anytime you have inflammation or issues in that area, it's going to cause a lot of mucus to come up. And because the mucus, of course, that's where your white blood cells are. They think it's an infection, which it is, and it's going to limit your breathing. So you're not going to be able to breathe out because you have less space. The next one we're going to talk about is emphysema. Emphysema is the enlargement of the alveoli, which causes the alveoli walls to become destroyed. Which will in turn, the lungs won't be as elastic. So when you're breathing out or expiring, you have to usually that's a passive process, but because the lungs can't do it on its own, then you use more muscles. So accessory muscles help breathing, exhausting the victims. You have that collapse. You can see that here. So this would be normal, and this would be like a collapsed lung. So this would be like you would have not a strong wall. What will eventually happen is your right ventricle will be completely overworked and become enlarged, because it's forcing. It has to do a lot more work to force the blood where it needs to go, which would be to the lungs, of course. Okay, so smoking. If you are smoking after this, I don't know what to do for you. But smoking effects on the trachea. Trachea is lined with cilia, so those cilia, we kind of learned about that in Unit 1. Basically, and this is what I was talking about, the mucus. So you have all these like mucus cells like lining the trachea, and the whole point of that mucus is to move things out of the respiratory system. So when you get sick, you have a lot of mucus, right? And you're coughing up this mucus. That's a sign that there's a bacterial or something in here that the body's like trying to get out. That's what it's there for. So what happens is when you smoke, it kills these cells. And basically the only way to get the debris out is to cough. So the cilia, the smoking smokes like basically destroys all the cilia. And then you've got all this excess mucus, and you have all the particles and everything, and it will stay there until you just cough it out. That's why smokers cough a lot. It's kind of what it looks like. This is a normal trachea here. Smoker, right? The carcinogens will start to damage, and then all you have left is the epithelial tissues below, and or not the pseudo. These are pseudostratified tissue, epithelial tissue, but it damages those, and then all you have left is what's below, and you have nothing to move it. So then basically anything that comes in, now you're still smoking, but you have nothing to move it out, so you just have to cough it out. So tobacco smoke, air pollution, and just this kind of just breaks everything down. I'll talk more about this later in the week, but basically, depending on what you destroy, if you either going to cause inflammation or you're going to break down the tissues. It just depends which one. With inflammation, that's when you get the bronchitis. With the destruction of the alveoli, that's emphysema. Either way, breathing is hard to do. Okay, that's it. And I will be breaking these down next week for you guys. I know it was a lot of information at once. So the rest of the week is just breaking it down and learning all the processes. Thank you very much.